Stories. Stories are what link one generation to another. Stories are the ties that bind us. They remind us who we are, where we've come from, where we hope to go. Stories engage the mind, they stir the soul. Stories give us identity and purpose.
In the resurrection, we have the greatest story ever told. The story that has changed billions of lives around the globe. The story that has changed the course of human history. The story that has brought freedom to the oppressed, healing to the sick, hope to the hopeless, peace to the restless, belonging to the lonely, strength to the weak, belief to the unbeliever, direction to the lost, and salvation for the sinner.
My story, your story, the greatest story ever told is God's victory over death so that you might live forever with Him. A story to connect you to God forever. This is the greatest story ever told. Story ever told.
Happy Easter. My name is David. I'm also one of the pastors here, and we welcome you to worship here in this space. You can see why we need a new sanctuary, but it's coming. It's coming soon, and we're thankful for your participation with us in worship this morning. I know that we're coming from all many different kinds of places, and like Levi mentioned in his prayer, some of us do feel like we are these spring flowers, basking in the goodness of God, a reminder that we are new creations. Some of us have come from brokenness, broken bodies or broken homes, broken relationships, broken hearts, and we've come to be reassembled, to get just a bit of good news. Many of us are here just because it's Sunday and we're in town and this is what we do, or at least on Easter we wander into a worship place, and so we're here, but we are all in need of a resurrection. And this is it, friends. This is the greatest story ever told. Would you please stand for the reading of the good news of Jesus Christ, our risen Lord and Savior? Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and she said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went towards the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and did and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. This is the word of God for the people of God. You may be seated. As I said, I'm not sure where you came from to get to the service this morning, but I can tell you as a pastor, I've come from a lot of busyness. I mean, that just kind of seems to happen on Easter Sunday mornings for us. We get really busy. And our first Easters in a new place, this isn't my first Easter here, but our first Easters can be particularly alarming. I remember my first Easter in Greenville, Alabama, the last church I served. I was over in a Sunday school area, walking down a hallway, and there was this door that almost never was open, swung open into the hall. And in it was this kind of dark, damp closet that we didn't want people going in, so we would deadbolt the outside of this door so kids wouldn't run into it. And so I looked, I called in, I closed the door, I deadbolted it, and I went over to the other building, the sanctuary building, to begin the service. About 20 minutes later, there was all this stirring in the sanctuary, and someone came up to me and said, "We can't find Melissa. Melissa's gone." Now, you know probably what's happened, right? I locked Melissa. She had gone into the closet to search for something. I didn't know it, and she's not a very loud person, evidently. For 20 minutes, she left in the closet, locked there, and someone had to go and rescue her just in time for the Easter service. But you need a cold, dark, damp tomb, I guess, to come out of on Easter. My first Sunday in Montgomery, I was wearing a suit outside. It was the sunrise service. Everything was beautiful. I was only supposed to do the prayer, and I was so excited but nervous at the same time. You know why that? And I stood there before the congregation. I lifted my hands up like this, and I looked down, and my fly was unzipped. And I was wearing a starched white shirt, and the tail was stuck out like a flag. And no one had said anything to me all morning long. There's no way they didn't see it. How do you recover from something like that? I knew I would always win the worst first Sunday Easter ever. But in seminary, we did have this friend. There were about 5 or 6 Baptist students that would come to our Methodist seminary and do the Baptist track. And one of them, his name was John, and he was telling us about his first Easter service in his new church. He was second career, so he had a little bit bigger of a church than some of the rest of us. And we had a clever nickname for him, John the Baptist. And you get great nicknames in seminary. And John the Baptist was telling us about his first Easter. He had a baptistry, because you have to go all the way under to be baptized in their churches, and it would sit up above the choir loft. And on Easter Sunday, they would do a baptism service for anybody who had made a decision and wanted to be baptized leading up to that particular Easter Sunday. And then after the baptisms, they'd all go and have some breakfast and come back for the main worship service. But John was told that some of the people would kind of leave after breakfast, make room for the other people to stay for the service. And he wanted everyone to hear his Easter message. And so he had this idea that he would do the baptisms and then hurry off to the side and change out of his waders and back into his normal clothes and go right up into the pulpit as they were singing the first hymn and then preach the Easter sermon message. And no break, nothing in between. So he's up there in the baptistry, and he's baptizing the young people. And then this woman comes forward, and John described him to us as a portly woman, which is the Baptist way of saying she was rather large. And she came into the baptismal font, and what was unanticipated was that she displaced much more water than they thought she would. And it started to trickle down into John the Baptist's waders. They wear these rubber boots, that come up like this and then are held by suspenders. And he realized this was happening. He baptized her, and even more, of course, water came into his waders. And she lifted up, and she was helped out to the left side. And he realized, this is a true story. He realized he was stuck in his spot, rooted to the bottom with 400 pounds of water in his waders. He couldn't move, and he couldn't reach the side to pull himself over, and so he has to undo his suspenders in front of the entire Easter congregation on his first Easter Sunday and swim off to the side and stand up in his nice shirt and his underwear in front of the whole church. John won the worst Easter ever. As pastors, we get all tied up in knots, but this day, Easter Day, is the most important day in all of human history. It is the day that I need every single day that I live. Every day of my life, I face some situation or I'm involved in someone else's life situation that I need the promise and the power and the peace of Easter. On this day, Jesus Christ conquered all sin, all death, and he rewrote the story of this fallen world. Your story, my story, our story is rewritten. It is no longer about darkness and death. It is now about light and life. That is the power of Easter. We get to stand with Jesus and say, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" You saw in our promo that we're going to do a sermon series coming up starting next week. It's going to be an exciting series where we look at these women of the Word and how they shaped the biblical story and how they shape our lives as faithful people today. And one of my favorite characteristics of the gospel is how they treat women, especially around the gospel. If you notice, in all four gospels, around the resurrection, in all four gospels, it is women who are the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. And it's the faithfulness of these women that allow the other disciples to move through the trauma of his death and burial. And it is the faith of these women who get all the other disciples to say for the first time, "The Lord is risen indeed." One of these awesome examples of faithfulness is Mary Magdalene. Mary had come to the tomb, and when she heard her Rabboni, her teacher, call her name softly and in that familiar voice, Mary, she knew in that one word that everything about her life was different. Everything about all of humankind would change with that one word. Jesus' body was hurriedly taken down from the cross and put into a borrowed tomb, and all the disciples went into hiding. They were afraid. Nothing was prepared. No one was prepared for what would happen next. As they came back to the tomb and they saw that the great stone had been rolled away and they peered into the tomb, they realized his body wasn't there. Mary begins to weep. Where is her teacher? Where is her Lord? Was all of this a mistake? Was all of this fake? Was any of this right and real? What is happening? And what have they done with my Lord, my teacher? This man I thought was the victor, the Savior. And the man she supposed to be the gardener called her name, and she knew it was Jesus. Your name is important. It recognizes who you are on a very intimate level. Some of you have heard me say that we named our son Joseph Thomas, because we wanted him to have a great start in life. And my dad's middle name is Joseph. Elizabeth's dad's middle name is Thomas. And we wanted these two great men to be remembered in his name and for him to have that reputation. We named our daughter Grace because it's our favorite word. It's God's unmerited, unconditional love. The other Mary, the mother of Jesus, she had a name that people respected. When they said Mary and they were talking to Jesus' mother, they thought of willingness, of loyalty. She had followed Jesus all of her life. She was so ready to serve God. But that wasn't the story for Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene had 7 demons cast out of her. She had what many would call today a dissociative disorder or a personality disorder, some kind of psychological disease. And the only reason I share that with you is because Jesus not only healed her, he chose her to be the first witness to the resurrection. He chose her to be the one that would declare the good news to the other disciples. And when he calls her Mary, she knows in that name, in that voice, that it's him. You see, other people would say, "Oh, here comes Mary." You know what I'm talking about. They used her name like that Mary, you know, the one you should watch out for, the one you don't really want to pass on the street but cross to the other side. Never Jesus spoke to her this way. Even before the resurrection experience, he would call her by name out of love, out of honor. He always treated her with dignity. He always invited her into a new life, a transformed existence. And now, just like in life and resurrection, he calls her with the same love, the same invitation to transformation. I have done it. There is no more evil, Mary. There is no wickedness that can hold me down in a tomb. I have overcome all the shadows. And because I am risen, you will come out of the ashes as well. And now we are invited into the garden with Mary. We come to the despairing tomb. Can anyone soothe our sufferings? Can anything cast out our fears? Can anything heal our brokenness? Can anyone give us a purpose and a new meaning and a new joy? And we hear Christ call us by name. And we know our story is being rewritten. It will not be defined by darkness and death. It will not end in a tomb, but our story is redrafted in hope, in peace. There is no shame of your past that he cannot overcome. There is no guilt. There is no destruction. There is no tragedy. There is no wickedness or evil or sin that he cannot remove from the story of your life and offer you an invitation to transformation, to new life, to new birth. Mary knew when he called her name that she was redeemed. Brothers and sisters, do you know that you have been redeemed? In 1947, a young couple met for the first time, and by September of 1949, they were married. He had started in the Navy as an E-1 on board one of the battleships in World War II. And just following the war, as the hostilities were ceasing, the Navy, like all of the other armed forces, were in a campaign to bring the boys home. There were 23 battleships in commission at the end of World War II, but by 1949, when this couple was married, there was only one. It was the USS Missouri that Truman kept in the fleet, only just really as a training battleship. Then in 1950, just a few months after they were married, the Korean War broke out, and the Missouri was sent back into battle, and the Navy started sending sister ships and needed new crews. And many of those crews were populated by the naval reserves that had already retired and started new lives. Our young couple had to leave the life they knew, the family they knew. They even had to, like so many, give up a considerable income to go work in the Navy again. Life was different, but it was out of duty, and it was out of honor, and it was out of what he knew was right that he went and he served. The first 6 years he was deployed in Korea and Vietnam, and he only came home a few months in those 6 years. And he said it was very difficult, but often he was distracted from his worry about home because there was so many times that they were incredibly vulnerable to gunfire and to war. He missed home, but he just didn't have a lot of time to worry over it. It was different for his wife back here in the States. She worried all the time. She was now raising the kids by herself. She didn't think there was going to be war ever again. She was trying to take care of the house and the community by herself. She was learning new ways to produce income for her loved ones, and she still found plenty of time to worry over her husband, where he was, what he was facing. They would go weeks, sometimes even months, without getting the next letter to even know he was okay. It was the only way to communicate was through letter writing. Our fellow made it all the way up to an E-9 and eventually became an officer on board the Franklin D. Roosevelt aircraft carrier. He was the first Navy officer to ever roll over from an E-9, and he continued to serve even after the ships were no longer needed in Vietnam. He and his wife knew this was his call, knew this was his duty. They found so much purpose in this life, and yet every time they were together, which would be for short months, 3 months at the longest, they would just worry the whole time over the next deployment because there was no way to communicate. And they just wanted to be able to hear each other's voice. And that bitterness started to grow in such a way that they invested in a new technology called ham radios. He bought a ham radio receiver. It was very hard to find in these days. And they went and registered. She was given a call sign, K4TGN. And he went off to sea, taking his little ham radio with him. And she went to the library. and she ordered every book she could on ham radios, read every single one of them, and started putting together not only receivers in her home, but oscilloscopes and towers. Her 3 children told me that her dining room table was covered in these towers. All over her bedroom floor were wires and tools and mechanical instruments, and she would have a Tupperware party in the living room to make a little bit of money to buy the next wire or the next tool that she needed. And when they would go to the library after school, the librarian would cower because they knew, here comes this lady. She's going to ask for some book we don't have, and we're going to have to go find it and order it and get it shipped here to her. And she would. She fought for that stuff. And then one day it happened. She had made a way to communicate to her husband. He tells me that the first time he heard her voice call his name over that ham radio was the happiest day he had ever had on a ship. Everything in that moment changed because now he had joy. He had a semblance of home and harmony that before wasn't there. He was completely disconnected, but now he had his connection to hope, to the knowledge of things to come. And that joy started to spread. The wives that were stationed with them in Norfolk, Virginia, started coming over to her house. And they would use her radio tower and her equipment to radio to him, and he would take the ham radio to their husband and let them talk to each other. And he told me that for weeks after a man would hear his wife's voice, he would just be filled with vigor and new life. And she said that the weeks after one of the spouses was able to speak to her husband, the tears of joy would come first, but then there was new strength, new courage for living a new day. Oftentimes in the middle of the night, she would get a call from a distressed spouse, really needing to hear from her husband. And so she would take her ham radio, hold it up to her phone receiver, call to her husband, he would get it on the ship, take it to that soldier, and through this awkward chain of communication, they were able to talk and spread a little bit of comfort. You see, without the ham radio, the only form of communication was a Class Easy call message. There was one cable that went across the ocean, and you had to have very special permission and be very high up to be able to use it, and only then in an emergency. There was no way to talk. And now suddenly, these sailors were being able to speak to their loved ones. Other people started learning it, and other branches of the military would come to her house. And at one time there in Norfolk, she was running ham radios to Newfoundland and the South Pole and the South Seas and the Mediterranean all at once. She was named Our Lady of the Year and put on the cover of the Military Spouses magazine that year because of the encouragement she brought to the guys on the ship and the encouragement she brought to the families back home. And it all started because she wanted her husband to be able to hear her say Ted, and for him to be able to hear her say Alice. Many of you know our Ted and Alice Beamer, rocks of this church. You see, nothing about their particular circumstances on the ship changed very much, but their whole perspective changed when they heard their spouse call them by name. When Jesus said Mary, in that moment, there was hope. There was new birth. There was a new perspective that life is about Christ's everlasting promise of peace, of hope in things to come, of the assurance that we are being remade and rewritten as kingdom versions of ourselves so that we might live with God forever. Ted and Alice Beamer, they told me about this young sailor who was on board one of Ted's ships, and he was staring into a tomb himself. He didn't cry the tears of Mary, that wasn't allowed of sailors, but he cried in his own way as his countenance fell, as he became depressed. He couldn't quite explain it. He didn't know how to describe what he was feeling. He was only 6 months into his first deployment. His wife was about to have their first child. And he just went through this gut-wrenching homesickness and loneliness, and he stopped talking to anyone. But Ted, his officer, he saw it, he felt it, and he would tell Alice about it in their ham radio conversations. Alice had a fighting spirit, let me tell you. And she had a soul for these young couples. You know what she did? She strapped on all of her tower and equipment and busted into the Navy Hospital in Jacksonville, Florida, and went right into that birthing suite and set it up as they were delivering that child. And she called Ted just at the right time, and that sailor heard the first cries of his newborn son through a ham radio. He got to call him by name for the first time and call his wife's name. And all the guys were gathered around, and Ted said that they celebrated so greatly for that hour. It was like they were back at home. They were not on the throes of a battleship anymore. They were no longer in war. They were there in joy and in new birth, in new life. And everything about this young man's spirit changed. He was lifted. Ted retired after 38 years of service. They moved to Perdido, and many of you knew them. He and his wife celebrated many happy occasions here in this church. 2 months ago was one of them when we had her celebration of resurrection. She was 96 years old. They were married 70 happy years together. What some of us don't know is that 20 years before she passed away, they had a granddaughter that was 5 years old and tragically died. And Ted and Alice had no idea how they were going to face that sorrow. They were burdened in a new way. They felt like life was over. They occasionally had gone to church on base, but not much. 5 days after the death of their granddaughter, something made them get up in the morning, it was Sunday, and drive to this church. They're not even sure why they chose this church, but they came here. And the sermon that morning was not just about the resurrection of the dead, but the resurrection that Christ offers the living. Resurrection from our sorrow and our sadness. Later that afternoon, Ted and Alice would go out onto a pier in Grand Lagoon, and they prayed their life over to Jesus Christ. And after that moment 20 years ago, they only missed 4 Sundays of worship. Right now, Ted is listening to us through Facebook Live, 97 years old, in his home. Hey, Mr. Ted. He wanted me to say a part of the story, which I didn't. The class easy call message came 5 days to that young soldier telling him his son was born. 5 days after Ted and Alice already make sure he knew his son was born. Sorry, I forgot that part. It was on that Sunday afternoon when they gave their life over to Christ that they knew in order to face death, but even more than death, in order to face the tragedy of their granddaughter passing away, that deep sorrow, they knew they had to keep the communication between God alive and open so that they could hear God call their name and they could call on God's name in praise, in worship, in fellowship. You see, Easter is so important because it is the day that allows us to face every other day, every other situation. Mary knew in that moment that she could have been burdened by the whole of her past, never able to serve God, never able to really live a full and joyous life because what she had done, but instead she was forgiven, she was redeemed, she was set free, she was offered a new chapter, a new life. She knew that God is the only one who can tell a story so great that its ending is actually our beginning. She knew on that day in the garden that her life was about to begin all over again. And it wasn't the particularities of the circumstance of Mary's life that changed, or the disciples' life. They just went from being the disillusioned, defeated disciples to the disciples filled with hope, filled with joy, to face every situation. It's the same with the ham radio. The guys were still on an aircraft carrier in the throes of war, but now they had the assurance of what was to come. They had a hope. They had something else to live for. They knew there was joy. The perspective that Christ gives us on this morning, that all our tragedy will end and our story will not be one of darkness but one of light. That is the true riches of heaven offered to us. He didn't promise those disciples prosperity or popularity or even the world's power. What he gave them was the most valuable thing in all creation. He gave them peace that passes this world's understanding. That in God all will be life. All will be light for you this day and forevermore. There are days in our lives that aren't easy. There are days in our life, moments we'd rather forget, where we feel like we want to give in or give up, but not today. There are days when the darkness surrounds us and the night seems endless. But today, dear friends, there is a sunrise brighter than any sun. Today, as we stare into that tomb to look for Jesus' body, we know by the power of God it is empty, and that you are not here by accident. You are loved beyond any measure you can ever know. You are invited into a transformation where everything in life is different, and you can now see with hope and joy and light. Today is Easter, and only God can write a story so great that its conclusion is our beginning. Today, your life begins all over again in hope, in joy, in resurrection. As you believe in the risen Christ, and he takes you by the hand and calls you by name, if you move with him in faith, you become a part of the greatest story ever told. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.